It's just gone 5 o'clock on a Saturday in late November, and from the BBC's Lime Grove Studio D, children's television history is about to be made. Because children's television on a Saturday is about to begin. The year is 1950, and this is the story of Whirligig. In the spring of 1950, the controller of BBC Television, Norman Collins, was finally able to do something which had been an ambition of his for some time: set up a dedicated children's department. Although there had been regular programmes for children on Sundays since television had resumed in the summer of 1946, Collins wanted a children's slot on every day of the week, according to newspaper reports at the time, because he felt that children were a powerful influence on their parents buying a television set. More sets meant more licence fee payers and more money coming into the television service. This expansion had previously been impossible within the confines of the BBC's television HQ at Alexandra Palace in North London, but now things were changing. The corporation had bought the Lime Grove Film Studios in West London to convert them for television use, while they waited for government permission for the resources and capital expenditure needed to build their new television centre down the road. As the BBC converted Lime Grove through early 1950, so they also went about recruiting producers for their new children's department. Initially, these 7 recruits, 4 women and 3 men actually, despite what the Evening Standard had expected, were under the temporary charge of Richmond Postgate, seconded from radio where he was the head of schools broadcasting. Over the summer, Postgate placed one of the chosen 7 in charge of putting together a children's variety magazine, which would run fortnightly at 5 p.m. every other Saturday. This producer was Second World War veteran and former Cambridge Footlights member Michael Westmore. The fortnightly schedule his show-to-be had been given was not unusual for BBC TV programmes at the time. Indeed, it was common, at least partly because of the rotas for the technical crews. The idea for the Saturday Variety magazine was inspired by Kaleidoscope, a popular evening entertainment programme which had an array of different elements: songs, sketches, a quiz, and even a drama serial in which viewers were invited to send in ideas for what should happen in the next instalment. By the end of July, the proposed new children's version of this had been given a name: Whirligig, as in a carousel or a roundabout or a set of gallopers. It was, like Kaleidoscope, to have various different features. One of the main requirements before Whirligig could get on air, though, was to find a presenter to link the whole thing together. The man who came up with the eventual idea for who should present the show wasn't producer Michael Westmore, but his temporary boss, one of the BBC's most experienced television men, Cecil Madden. Madden had been one of the senior television producers since the start of the service in 1936, but now the BBC didn't know quite what to do with him. So, with Richmond Postgate returning to radio and no suitable candidate to be head of children's programmes yet found, at the end of August 1950, Madden was the next person to be given the job temporarily, with the task of getting 7-day-a-week children's shows underway by the end of the year. Sundays had already been going, Wednesdays had started in May, and Fridays were due to start that September. For Saturdays, the big day would come with the launch of Whirligig in late November. And at a lunch held by the agent Harry Dubens, Madden met the man he regarded as the perfect fit to front Whirligig, 31-year-old actor Humphrey Lestocq, who was then well known for his role as Flying Officer Kite in the radio comedy series Merry-Go-Round. Yes, he went from one roundabout synonym to another. Madden also encouraged Michael Westmore to take on other elements which would become part of the Whirligig lineup. He'd been impressed by the act of artist Francis Coudrill, who had a puppet cowboy character called Hank, and suggested Coudrill's stories of Hank's adventures could form a regular part of the programme. And he suggested lifting the viewer storyline serial feature wholesale from Kaleidoscope, complete with its presenter there, Frank Coven, and this became Whirligig's Write It Yourself serial. Westmore, meanwhile, was trying to find a sidekick for Lestocq. He'd been impressed by the puppeteering of Joy Laurey of the Laurey Puppet Company and came up with a character for her to build and operate for the show, an impish, officious, wry but not unfriendly little sprite named Mr. Turnip, who Westmore drew sketches of and developed a characterisation for Laurey to build the resulting puppet from. So it was that at exactly 5 p.m. and 50 seconds on Saturday the 25th of November 1950, BBC Television began their first regular Saturday tea-time broadcast with the opening episode of Whirligig. This was very much an island in the schedule, following an hour of blank screens and tuning signals since the afternoon's sports coverage had ended, and with nearly 2 hours of nothing afterwards until the evening's musical Carissima. Whirligig opened with Film of Some Gallopers, accompanied just for this episode by a version of Schubert's Marche Militaire. From at least 1953, they were using specially shot film of a large model set of gallopers built by Mr. Herbert Slack of Derbyshire, although it's not certain if this was what was used right from the start. The theme music certainly changed after episode 1, switching for the rest of the first series to the Black Dyke Mills Band's version of the Poet and Peasant Overture. Whirligig came live from Studio D up on the 4th floor of the North Block at Lime Grove. This had been the first studio to open there after conversion to television and had immediately been assigned as the children's studio to get 7-day-a-week 5pm slots off the ground. If people have heard of Lime Grove Studio D now, it's usually to do with Doctor Who having begun there in 1963, when it was regarded as old, run-down, cramped and totally unsuitable for such a show. In 1950, however, it was a very different story, giving producers space and capabilities they'd never had at Alexandra Palace. Indeed, so coveted was it that in 1952 children's shows, including Whirligig, would be relegated to the smaller Studio H, so the drama department could make use of Studio D. Later, children's would move again to Studio E next door to D, and these would be the 3 studios in which Whirligig would be made throughout its existence. Also very much associated with Doctor Who is Peter Hawkins, later the voice of the Daleks, but on Whirligig gaining his first television voiceover work, breathing life into Mr. Turnip as Joy Laurey operated the puppet live in the studio. Humphrey Lestocq and Mr. Turnip, or HL and just Turnip as they would more informally and commonly be referred to in Whirligig, linked the whole show together, although not off the cuff. Michael Westmore had hired a young scriptwriter called Peter Ling, later known for co-creating Compact and Crossroads, to write the HL and Turnip sequences. These effectively formed their own little sketch show or even sitcom segments. In the first series, there was a linking device of HL having a control panel, modelled on the radio mixing desks of the period, from which he activated the other items in the programme. But so popular was HL and Turnip's interplay that this conceit became unnecessary. The desk was blown up at the end of the first series, and after that HL and Turnip ceased to really function as presenters at all, simply appearing in between the other items rather than introducing them as such. First item up in the very first episode was the Box of Tricks conjuring slot, where magician Geoffrey Robinson would demonstrate tricks, sometimes with special guests, but also usually including a simple trick children could try at home. Robinson would occupy the slot through much of Whirligig's life, although not all the way through. For the 4th series, Harry Corbett and Sooty would be brought aboard to showcase their own particular brand of magic, having been a popular element of one of Whirligig's Saturday teatime companion shows, Saturday Special. Whirligig's fortnightly schedule meant it ran alongside several other programmes during its life. The first series alternated on Saturdays with Telescope, created by Cecil Madden and debuting the week after Whirligig. Initially co-presented by actors Peter Madden and Valerie Hobson, it was nonetheless more grounded in the real world than Whirligig, designed as the enlightenment to Whirligig's entertainment. Showing children how to make and do things, and including educational features and bringing live animals into the studio, it was almost a kind of proto-Blue Peter. But Saturday was the wrong slot for that sort of thing, and Telescope was a bit of a mess. Overcrowded, under-rehearsed, and under threat of early cancellation. Peter Madden was demoted after 2 episodes and replaced by newcomer Cliff Mitchellmore, and even its puppet character, Butterball, suffered some mysterious controversy, being dropped after 3 episodes due to a falling out between the BBC and Butterball's creator, Jock Gaffron. Telescope did stagger on for a full run alongside Whirligig into the summer of 1951, but was then replaced for the next 2 years by the more Whirligig-like Saturday Special, initially also produced by Michael Westmore, and starring Peter Butterworth alongside Porterhouse the Puppet Parrot, also voiced by Peter Hawkins. Then there was Sugar and Spice, interestingly initially presented by female impersonator and ventriloquist Ronald Kimberly in his Bobby Kimber persona, almost certainly the first such presentation in children's television. None of these, however, could ever match the appeal and impact of Whirligig. HL and Turnip became one of the most popular and best-known double acts of the era, and companies bid for licenses to make Mr. Turnip tie-in merchandise of many and various kinds, not just toys, books and comic strips as you might expect, but soap, balloons, records, clothing, slippers, masks, scarves, party invitations, and even silver charms for Christmas puddings. Back on day 1, next item up in the studio after the magic slot was Flying Visit, a game children could play along with at home, guessing which foreign countries were being dropped in on during some imaginary helicopter trips. This was not one of Whirligig's long runners, not even lasting the full first series, and eventually being succeeded in later years by the show's competition corner. We do know, however, that Flying Visit used a sound effect of a Sikorsky helicopter taking off, and as this sound effect of a Sikorsky of the era taking off is available today from the BBC Sound Effects library, perhaps it's even the very same one. An element which did last for much longer in the show, though, was drama. Initially, this was with Frank Coven's Write-It-Yourself slot, with Coven introducing the story of Bobby, Annie and Brian discovering a mystery lurking in a hidden vault, which Mrs. Inksip and Alexander Scrope were also after. Scrope being played by Peter Hawkins, which was the role he was first hired for, before also being asked to voice Turnip. Coven introduced the item and then appeared at the end with some tips, as well as a model of the set for the next episode. This is for the protection of the producer, Michael Westmore explained in the Radio Times, who visualises that unless some limit is set to young imaginations, he may have to order herds of seals and rockeries of penguins for an exciting incident on an ice floe off Spitsbergen. Write It Yourself would last until the spring, when eventually it was decided, as Westmore later wrote, the plots should be entrusted to grown-up scriptwriters with less bloodthirsty tastes. The storyline and characters from Write It Yourself, though, were continued in the first series' final serial, In Search of the Shadow. But from the autumn of 1951 there was to be something new. Lime Grove Studio D was to give rise to its, and British television's, first science fiction series. This featured Britain's leading experimental rocket scientist, who is a professor called Bernard, and used music by Holst for its soundtrack. Although the professor in this case was Watkins rather than Quatermass, and although it did use Mars, Bringer of War at points, for its title music, Stranger from Space used another Holst piece, The Perfect Fool. Written by husband and wife team Hazel Adair and Ronald Marriott, Stranger from Space, or The Stranger from Space as it was initially titled before losing the definite article partway through its run, tells the story of the friendship between a teenage boy from the south of England, Ian, and a crashed Martian he meets, Billifodorus, or Bill for short, helping him get to Professor Watkins, who could perhaps aid him in getting home. The first series of Stranger from Space ran for 10 mostly fortnightly episodes from the autumn of 1951 to the spring of 52. It was supposed to be 11 episodes, but in the week that King George VI died in February, Whirligig, and hence Stranger from Space, was cancelled. This turned out to be a major problem, as Brian Smith, who played Ian, had already been able to negotiate an early release from the production to go on tour with the Old Vic Theatre Company. The episode in which Ian was to have been written out, surrendering himself to the authorities pretending to be Bill because said authorities, although having found them, don't know what the Martian looks like, was the one which was cancelled because of the King's death. This necessitated a hasty rewrite and also a truncation of the story from 11 to 10 episodes, probably as contracts were already in place with the cast of the next serial, Peter Ling's circus set Big Top, so Stranger from Space couldn't go on for an extra episode. The perils of live transmission, never mind also having to fit onto just one or two sets in a studio also rigged for other features in the show and having no more than at the very most half a dozen characters per episode. Stranger from Space did return for a 6-part sequel in the autumn of 1952 though, with Brian Smith also returning, and was also later novelised with illustrations by none other than Tony Hart, reproduced here by kind permission of his daughter Carolyn. Back in November 1950, the final item in the first Whirligig before the goodbye from HL and Turnip was to be another of its most popular and long-running features, Francis Coudrill's Tales of Hank the Cowboy. These had two elements. Coudrill would introduce the segment with his Hank puppet, and also a puppet of Hank's horse, Silver King. This would then segue into one of Hank's tall tales, told via a kind of live animation, with two easels set up across the studio for 2D puppets Coudrill had created of the characters to be moved across backgrounds he'd also painted appropriate for that week's story. These graphics were operated by Alfred Wormser, later to be noted for his skill with graphics on the likes of The Sky at Night, the BBC's general election programmes, sports results for Grandstand, and a whole range of other types of programming. Hank's slot would also have a musical element, usually introduced with the song Tough, Mighty Tough in the West, and played out to She'll Be Coming Round the Mountain. Whirligig's music man for most of its run would be Steve Race, who would even eventually get his own slot on the show, Room for Music. He wasn't present on the very first episode. He had been chosen, but was unavailable on the 25th of November, so Bert Whittam stood in for the show's debut. But Race would soon make his mark and would eventually provide a very important new element to the programme. After Strauss's Perpetuum Mobile was used as the theme tune for the second series, Race wrote Whirligig its own theme tune, which was used from 1952 onwards, the Whirligig Song. I wasn't able to find any recording of this, but the sheet music was reproduced in one of the Whirligig books. So here it is, played by my friend Kate Brewster. That would be the theme song for a generation of children's Saturday tea time television, but in the summer of 1954 it played Whirligig out for what was supposed to be the final time, as the show came to an end after 4 series. It's not entirely clear why. Feedback and audience figures were still good, and that 4th series had received a boost from Sooty's presence. The driving force behind the show, Michael Westmore, would soon leave for one of the ITV companies, but he was still there when Whirligig finished, and even helped create and launch its short-lived successor, Jigsaw. Whatever the case, a year later, the BBC changed their minds. With ITV due to launch in the autumn of 1955, head of children's programmes Frida Lindstrom decided to bring back Whirligig, although not without some difficulties. Westmore had now gone, and he took H.L. and Turnip's scriptwriter Peter Ling with him to Associated Rediffusion. Music man Steve Race would soon follow, and arguments over money and creative control meant there would be no return to Whirligig for Francis Coudrill and Hank. The BBC co-owned Mr. Turnip and had signed Humphrey Lestocq to a new 3-year contract, so the presenting duo returned, as did Geoffrey Robinson and his box of tricks. But the revived Whirligig lasted for only a single series, and when the Whirligig Song played them out once again in June 1956, this time it really was the end. H.L. and Turnip became 2 of the ghosts of children's television past. Reading some of the scripts for Whirligig, what most strikes me is how its format of a studio presenter and attendant puppet linking between various items and features, and breaking away for scripted serial adventures and comedy, feels like a forerunner of the kind of show that would come to dominate Saturday morning programming several decades later, the likes of Going Live and Live and Kicking. Its legacy can perhaps even be felt in the type of in-vision children's BBC presentation which also started in the 1980s, or perhaps resumed in the 1980s, and survives to this day. Unfortunately, however, we have no direct evidence to know for sure quite how it came across on screen. All of Whirligig's 90-odd episodes were broadcast live, and it's very unlikely that any of them were ever recorded. Certainly nothing of the series survives today. There had been some consideration given in early 1951 to shooting some material with H.L. and Turnip for the children's section of the television demonstration film, which ran every morning for the benefit of those selling TV sets, but sadly it didn't happen. Even Lime Grove Studios itself is long gone now, demolished in the early 1990s, although if you do go to Lime Grove today, you can still make out where the studios once stood. They were where the sand-coloured brick of the 90s houses replaces the older red brick terracing, which ran right up to the side of the studios, and many of those older houses were used as BBC offices during the corporation's 40 years there. And if you turn right out of the southern end of Lime Grove and take a stroll 15 minutes or so along Goldhawk Road, you can still see the venue for many of Whirligig's rehearsals, Soulgrave Youth Club, or Soulgrave Boys Club as it was at the time, where every other week Humphrey Lestocq, Peter Hawkins, Joy Laurey and company would spend several days rehearsing in the lead-up to each show. The club is still going strong today, with its greatest pop culture claim to fame probably being its role as the birthplace of the band which would one day become The Who. As for H.L. and Turnip, well, you can get a glimpse of them in action when they dusted off the old routines nearly 30 years on for BBC Two's 6:55 in 1983. There's a clip embedded in a piece I've written for the BBC website, link in the description below. And if you'd like to know even more about the whole story, then stay tuned, because in 2026, my book When Saturday Came, the story of the BBC's Saturday tea time shows from 1950 to 1963, is coming from Telos Publishing. The link to their website is in the description too, so keep an eye out there. Because there are plenty more tales to tell about Whirligig and of Saturday tea time television in the days before Doctor Who.